So the LUSD folks, they actually, LUSD is a stable coin.
Yep, one of my favorite projects.
It's got this interesting minting mechanism where LUSD is a little above peg always, based on how it's minted. So it's never below 1, it's never above 1.1, and
right.
it drifts in between there. And so something like a stable swap pool, like you have on Curve or any of the stable swap clones these days, is tricky because the peg is not really 1; it's this soft peg in this range. And what happens in a stable swap pool for LUSD is you end up not having much LUSD. When price is above peg, LUSD leaves the pool and you just have the other asset.
Makes sense.
And that's a problem for LUSD because it means it's not very liquid, right?
Right.
And so in Maverick, they created this distribution which is overweight LUSD. It's asymmetric. So for people who aren't seeing the screen, it's purple is LUSD and blue is Circle or USDC. And it's overweight and asymmetric in the LUSD side. And this is the distribution that they were always hoping they could.
That's brilliant.
And what's super cool is they can also incentivize this. So this just got turned on, and I think there'll be incentives here at some point. So now instead of doing LP farming for an entire pool, a protocol can incentivize a given distribution inside of a pool. And maybe one day they want to incentivize this distribution, the next day they want to incentivize that distribution. So it gives it we call it the surgical flexibility to do liquidity shaping on their aggregate liquidity across all of DeFi, all of crypto.
Welcome to Mission DeFi with Brad Nickel, where we explore projects in decentralized finance that are innovating and driving our mission of financial freedom forward. Thank you for listening. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, and review Mission DeFi and spread the word by posting a tweet to the show. All opinions expressed by Brad Nickel or his guests are their opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Black Knox, Material Indicators, or any other affiliated organizations. You should not treat any opinion expressed by Brad Nickel or his guests as an inducement to make a particular investment, follow a particular strategy, or become involved with any project. A project being featured on the show is not an endorsement of that project in any way. This podcast is for informational purposes only. Now, here's Mission DeFi with Brad Nickel.
All right, I'm excited today because I've got Bob Baxley from Maverick Protocol, and it looks like they're doing some really interesting stuff with AMMs and how people and investors can manage their liquidity in their DEX. And so I'm looking forward to learning all about this. Bob, thanks so much for joining me. If you wouldn't mind giving us a quick introduction to yourself, your background, how you ended up in the crypto world, and then we'll climb into Maverick and what value it brings to the ecosystem.
Sure. Hey, Brad. Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Sure.
So I've got a technical background. I went to graduate school for signal processing and actually wireless communication. So it's kind of information theory, that sort of thing. And I ended up as a faculty member at Georgia Tech for about 8 years doing basic and applied research.
That's impressive all by itself. Georgia Tech background professor. That's awesome, man.
Yeah, so I was teaching there, and then I caught the startup bug in 2014 and joined or co-founded a cybersecurity startup. It was actually a mix of wireless communications and cybersecurity. We raised $50 million, and I was the CTO there for 8 years, and it's now thriving. And I on the side started getting more and more interested in crypto, kind of dabbled in crypto starting in 2017, 16. Even contemplated some ICO white papers back in those days. And then one of my buddies really got into crypto, and we jumped and started Maverick together.
Wow. When did you start Maverick?
2021 is, so we did a little seed round of investment then, and then a bigger round of investment in early 2022.
Were you fascinated with the tech? Were you interested in the investing? What kind of drew you to crypto? Was it the ideals? What was your initial attraction?
I mean, the whole thing is just fascinating, right? It's just
right.
New paradigm. The pattern matching with the early internet days is very compelling, right? There's a whole new paradigm. It's going to be fun to get in early. Who knows where the space is going, but there's going to be all kinds of interesting things happening. The idea of frictionless money is super compelling, right? Some of the detractors talk about crypto not having accomplished much, but the idea that you can transmit money across the world for essentially nothing for free, or value across the world for free, and you have got all these, you remove friction from all the kind of financial things that exist in the world, in the TradFi world. There's big things happening in crypto. So I'm certainly a maxi there. And then on the tech side, also super fascinating, right? The idea that we can write these smart contracts. They run on this massive distributed virtual machine. They're immutable. You get all kinds of interesting guarantees. And I don't know, the whole thing is fascinating from all kinds of perspectives.
You were, I would assume, in the tech world, you were in wireless communications, security. You were dealing with some fairly low-level languages at that point as well. Was Solidity, probably from your background, easier to adapt to than probably for other developers, do you think, when you dove in?
Solidity is a cool, interesting language, right? It's got, it's actually not that complicated a language. There's not that many exotic language features like in something like C++.
Right.
But what's interesting is, it's like you're programming on a floppy disk. You got 24 and a half kilobytes for your whole smart contract,
that's awesome.
Which is quite a constraint, right? I mean, we spent a lot of time pruning down our code to get there, which is, the code is certainly cleaner when you are forced to those sort of constraints. You don't have any gruff in there, any cruft, which is just inefficient. So
yeah, it's interesting. I talked to an assembly dev that was doing Solidity once, and they, obviously they have their constraints, but for them it was like not a big deal to adapt. But that's really interesting, and it's true. I mean, I guess the beauty of the constraints are that theoretically it makes you able to see more clearly the things that could be a problem for you, right? Whether it's potential exploits or whatever. It really forces you to kind of look at the big picture of what you have, and then really be able to analyze it a little easier. I mean, I know it's still difficult, but
there's no, you don't end up with any bloat in your code because there's no room for bloat.
Yeah.
And then, the attack surface, as a person with a cybersecurity background, I mean, that's also super fascinating. There's such clever people out there coming up with these exotic multi-step, flash loan and flash transaction attacks. It's really interesting.
Well, and I guess it's when you think about it, it's less about hacking code and more about how can you exploit the engines that are being deployed, right? And so and thinking through all the variables and all the parameters of that's really interesting. But I'm sure with your security background, it kind of makes you a little more paranoid than the average developer in terms of examining what could be possible with what you're deploying.
Yeah, no, I certainly appreciate security audits. So we were really thorough with our audits and really thorough with the testing. And there's just all kinds of you do a lot of work to make sure you've got a buttoned up protocol. And you make an interesting point. Like some of the vulnerabilities are just boneheaded Solidity moves, but then some of them are engine based, where the protocol didn't consider this sort of Oracle-based attack, or it's not really Solidity. It's more like the mechanics of the protocol that gets attacked.
Right, and that's probably a dominant percentage of the attacks that happen, I think, for the most part. So, all right. So you started in 2021 with Maverick.
Mm-hmm.
Is what you ended up with what you envisioned you were creating in 2021?
No, we did a few pivots actually.
Okay.
Yeah, and so that's maybe kind of fun to talk through.
Yeah, sure.
We started out thinking that the derivative space was interesting. I mean, it certainly is,
Sure.
but we realized we wanted to do, the mechanism we were considering, we wanted to do it without an Oracle, and so then you need price discovery mechanisms. So you end up with, if you want to price derivatives, usually need an Oracle, or you can have some sort of market way to price them. And so one option for that is to have an AMM that does the pricing for you.
Right.
And then you are in this challenge, well, which AMM do you choose? And when we got to the bottom of that rabbit hole, we realized, well, we didn't like any of the AMM designs for what we were going to try to do in derivatives. So we decided, let's go do an AMM first. One day we may still get to derivatives and leverage and whatnot, but for now it's just, we thought we've got differentiating technology to contribute in the AMM space. So that's where we started here. And that was, it took us a year to build it. We went through all kinds of iterations. One kind of neat, one epiphany that we had was, there's protocols that kind of pitch, we've got a strategy, and this is a strategy that will make you money as an LP, and it'll do that, robustly. I think, those are, it's a hard pitch, right?
Sure.
There's always a tension. There's nothing's free here. There's no free lunch. And so typically there's some corner case or something where that kind of falls apart. So the idea that you're pitching a protocol as a hedge fund that's always going to make your LPs money is not a good, it's silly. I think Uniswap did a great job kind of building an AMM or a protocol that's really the fundamental money Lego.
Right.
Go look at the money, the Uniswap pitches. It's not you're going to make a bunch of money. There is capital efficiency, and we've got all this flexibility. And so for Maverick, we think of it as that as well. It's not a hedge fund. We've built a money Lego that can enable new degrees of freedom for LPs who want to LP in an AMM.
That's
beyond what's available. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. With the understanding that kind of, I'm just gathering this so you can correct me. But what I'm gathering from the website is that you're giving LPs tools to maximize not only kind of what strategies they might have, but also based on market conditions and being able to kind of set things without constantly having to manage it, right? And so you can kind of set these, we'll talk about it more in a minute, you can kind of set these degrees of which way you think things are going and pattern the moves of your pool around that. And I think that was, to me, looking at that, it looks like definitely something I haven't seen in the market yet. I mean, it obviously, these concentrated pools remind me of kind of V3 and managing that. And my first inclination before I realized you were the AMM was that this was some kind of tool for managing those liquidity pools. So I find it interesting that you've kind of taken this approach, because I think there's a really strong appeal here for larger liquidity, well, any liquidity provider, but obviously more sophisticated, larger liquidity providers that would want to really be able to optimize what they're doing and kind of reduce their risks to some extent, right? Not that you're saying it reduces risks or eliminates risks, not financial advice, but
Right. Yeah. I mean, so we gathered input from a few directions. So personally, we were LPing in AMMs, traded AMMs. And then we went and talked to a bunch of professional LPs and big funds and whatnot. And there was kind of a consistent pain point where, concentrated AMMs are great. They give you more capital efficiency. And capital efficiency means how much volume your position does divided by how big the position is. And the reason people talk about that is because it's a proxy for fee. So the more capital efficiency equals more fee.
Sure.
So what you end up having to do, or what the pros do in say Uniswap, is they're constantly moving around their positions.
Right.
And there's protocols like Gamma and Arrakis that try to live on top of Uniswap and do that for you, but it ends up being really gassy, and it's not the most elegant approach. And so we decided, let's just build that natively into the AMM.
Nice.
So that you, as an LP, can choose to have your liquidity move with price, and then there's a bunch of knobs you can turn. You can have it move right and only right with price, or left and only left. You want to make a bearish bet in both directions. You can modulate the time kind of lag before it moves, and the price movement that's required before it moves. So these are all knobs available to you. And in a sense, Maverick could be considered more complicated to get into, but once you pick a position, then the protocol moves around your liquidity in whatever direction you've specified without you having to re-interact again. And And so at the end of the day, you end up with this, really flexible thing. We expect other people will build on top of this. There's no reason that Gamma or Arrakis couldn't build on top of Maverick and kind of further smooth out strategies or make even more complicated meta strategies. So the way we think about Maverick, if you think about UniV2 or Sushi, those are infinite range AMMs.
Right.
And then UniV3 is a range AMM because you're staking a given range. In Maverick, we call it a dynamic distribution AMM. And so the dynamic part is this idea that LPs can choose to have the liquidity move with price. So the liquidity can be dynamic. And then distribution is this idea that instead of, in range AMMs like UniV3, the liquidity distribution is always a rectangle. It's got a flat top.
Right.
But in Maverick, you can actually specify any distribution you want. So bell curves or exponential shapes or walls or whatever, a cell ramp. And there ends up being all kinds of interesting use cases for having different shape distribution. The part of the inspiration for that was there was a paper out of Harvard that said that the optimal distribution is actually not a uniform distribution. It's this exponential distribution. So if you want to weigh the mix of risk and reward as an LP, you should be staking exponential distributions, not range AMMs or range distributions. But then there's some other neat use cases that maybe we can get into as we go along here.
Cool. In doing your research, one of the common things that you hear people say is that nobody's making money LPing on Uniswap, right? And obviously somebody's making money, you would think, or they wouldn't be doing it. But did you find that to be primarily true, though, that it was so difficult to manage whether V2 or V3 that people weren't necessarily making much from it?
Yeah, I think you definitely have to pick the right pair, and you have to have an efficient AMM. There's certainly, so the LP is usually making a bet in typical AMMs that the price will go sideways.
Right.
And so as it stays sideways, the LP collects fee, and if it deviates from sideways, the LP starts picking up impermanent loss. And if they leave, they make that loss, concrete. So it looks like you're selling a put option is another way to think about it, where you're really betting the price would go sideways. And that, sometimes that's profitable, sometimes it's not. For a euphoric market in a certain pair like Pepe, doing really well, LPs are in there. If you've got like no volume and you're in a volatile pair where there's little volume but there's lots of movement, LPing is probably not a good idea in that case. But then, so the typical AMM bet is a sideways bet. The neat thing about Maverick's movement modes is they enable directional bets.
Nice.
Where you can have a bet that the price of one asset or the other will go up relative to the other. So that's mode right or mode left. And now it's not so much a sideways bet. It's you can still be profitable even if the asset goes up or down, as long as you've picked the right direction.
Yeah, that's quite the promise. That's awesome.
Yeah. So that's a unique thing that's in Maverick.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing that's going on in AMMs that we realized once we got into space is, there's all kinds of protocols and tokens that need liquidity on chain.
Right.
And they're willing to incentivize that liquidity, in terms of boosts and farms and LP farming and that sort of thing, LP mining, to get the liquidity on chain because they need that liquidity for their token to be viable. So I think there's a whole dimension of that going on, which is also part of what we're doing at Maverick in our phase 2 launch, which we just launched last week, that I can maybe get into too. But I think that, so while not all LP positions are profitable, and you look at Uniswap and you say, well, why is there $50 million here if the yield is relatively low? Sometimes it's just because people are market making a token for kind of alternative purposes.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, okay, so I definitely want to step into kind of you showing us the product and how it functions. And for folks that are listening on the podcast, I encourage you to go to the YouTube link in the show notes that I'll put in there so you can see what he's going to share, what Bob's going to share. But in terms of kind of how you approach this strategically, obviously it's one thing to say to LPs, hey, we have a better way to do this. You can provide liquidity here. But you also have to have people that are actually using it for swaps or make yourself Legos that are available in the system. What's kind of been your approach to that, and have you found that difficult to penetrate the market in terms of getting volume and working with other protocols, or whatever your strategy might be?
Sure. I think that's really another kind of example of why DeFi is better than TradFi. So to get volume, there's lots of volume that goes through aggregators these days. 1inch,
Right.
AeroSwap, and CalSwap.
Right.
And so as soon as you integrate with those folks, and for many of them, integrating is just you writing your own pull request.
Nice.
Once you do that, and if you've got a protocol that's got liquidity around price, then you just start getting volume.
That's awesome.
And so it's great for users, right? Because now it's not like a brokerage account in TradFi where you're locked to your money is custodied at whoever it is, Charles Schwab or E-Trade, whoever it is.
Right.
And it's very cumbersome to move your money to a different exchange. In DeFi, you don't have any of that friction. And so when new protocols come out that have a better system, better pricing, whatever it is, it's trivial to switch strategies. So that's been our strategy, is just get integrated with all the aggregators, and we are now. And so the pools where we've got deeper liquidity than other dexes, we get trade flow. That's
awesome. It's funny that I hadn't. I interviewed a project a few weeks ago, and they talked about that 1inch. They were driving a lot of volume for 1inch,
mm-hmm.
or were gaining a ton of volume from 1inch and actually becoming a majority of it. But I hadn't thought about that strategically as, hey, this is the way to get your DEX rolling is just to plug into these, because then at that point you're just competing from the user's perspective on, are you providing me the best price, or what are the steps to getting there, or whatever. So that makes a ton of sense. I love that. Makes me want to start a DEX.
Well, it's
just kidding.
It's also you don't see that kind of structured. I mean, the cool thing about DeFi is that you've got all these projects that all have open APIs, because that's just how the blockchain works.
Sure.
They permissionlessly communicate with each other and integrate with each other. And so you get these really nice stacks of nice UX things. So in this case, it's aggregators talking to a bunch of DEXs. There is no analogy for that in TradFi, right?
Yeah, no.
I think it's really an example of where there's just friction, incumbents, and cartels in TradFi that are skimming, right? There's lots of rents being given there, and I hopefully that persists because of policy things, and I think eventually we'll see it persist less, or there'll be more opportunity for DeFi to go eat up those markets, hopefully.
Yeah, it's regulatory enforced grift, right? I mean, it's forced middlemen in order to protect us, right? And so obviously, it's one of the arguments I make all the time about the politics of this, is that our framing is horrible in the political realm, because my point is that rather than beg not to be regulated, we should be demanding proactively that we're a solution that makes this better and stops taking money from investors, right? And so anyway, you can get me started on that. We'll be on here for 20 minutes. All right, so let's do this. Let's walk through, if you're cool, let's walk through the application, and let's see what you've got, and explain to us how it functions.
Sure. So let me share my screen here.
Cool.
Sure. So I'm going to open up with, we've had some pretty good success early on here. So we were number 3 the other day among
nice
Ethereum dexes. So
wow, that's awesome, man.
Yeah, doing great volume. When we launched, we were 30, and so to be 3, we're 3 to 5 most days.
Wow,
is really great.
That's got to feel good. I mean, did you have a perception that you were going to be able to get to that level so quickly, or was it surprising?
It was a little surprising. I think we didn't realize kind of how efficient some of the LP modes were in getting volume from dexes, and that's really been the differentiator. So,
that's fantastic.
Yeah. And I kind of missed a whole narrative we have, which is, maybe I'll walk through this, and I'll walk through.
Great. Okay.
So in Maverick, before I do this, let me show you kind of what happens in this little video clip. So this is a mode static. This is similar to a range AMM position.
Okay.
What we're seeing on the screen here is price is in a range, is in a range, like think about like a Uni V3 sort of range.
Right.
When price is in that range, you collect fee, and that's shown on the screen here. And then I've got another plot on the screen that shows the price over time. And when the price leaves the range, you stop collecting fee.
Right.
So, this is the issue with static positions without rebalancing is if the price is just going to leave range permanently, then your liquidity is not collecting fee. It's useless. You should, unless somebody's incentivizing you to leave it there, you should either move it or do something else with it.
And the goal of that system is to reduce the risk of impermanent loss, right? I mean, the idea is you're sitting in that range. You're not. Well, does it? does being in that range prevent that?
Impermanent loss is a little tricky. So for a range AMM, there's a couple ways to define it, which is funny. So you can define it as denominated in the quote asset or the base asset or the mix of assets that you bring to the pool.
Right.
But in general, if the price goes up a lot, you are left holding the less valuable asset here.
Right.
So if you had held the more valuable asset, you would be doing better for sure.
Sure.
So yeah, this shows up not only as not collecting fee, but also as impermanent loss. If we look at, I changed the screen, and now we're looking at what we call a mode right position in Maverick. It's the same price trajectory, and there's a time-weighted average price that's calculated in the smart contract. And when the price leaves the range, it's called TWAP, time-weighted average price. When the TWAP leaves the range will follow. And so in this case, an LP has chosen to follow right and only right. And so it's kind of like a ratchet mechanism where the liquidity does not move left, it only follows right. And that protects you from what could end up being permanent loss, actually. So this is still an IL only position. But what happens, we're seeing the price trajectory is the price has gone up and you're able to stay in range a lot more often. And so you collect more fee. This is kind of the idea.
That's awesome.
Following right. So in the user interface, if you go to the Mav and you click on one of the positions and you go through the kind of the add liquidity wizard, the first thing you're presented with is choosing one of these modes. And there's a little diagram, a kind of animation that shows you what happens when price moves to your liquidity. And so you can stake one of these if you want to make a directional bet. And mode right here means I think tether is going to go up relative to circle and vice versa if I pick mode left. So that's the movement modes. And then the distribution part that I was talking about, if we click static, there's an option here to change the distribution of liquidity. And so one of the options is flat. And this is the distribution you have in a range AMM. It's flat.
Right.
The x-axis is price, the y-axis is liquidity. And as I was saying, there was that paper that said that exponential is actually the right mix of risk and reward. So you're able to pick that preset in Maverick as well. But you can also pull up and down these bars and create any distribution you want.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that's pretty cool.
So this is applying settings. It's not just a UI into the choice you made. That's awesome.
Yeah, so if I can pick an asset mix here, and so I picked a distribution. I kind of handmade a distribution, and then you type in how much you want to stake, and you'll get a distribution in that shape.
Wow.
And so what are the use cases for that? There's a few, and we're actually learning more all the day. I just did a tweet about how asymmetric bimodal distribution could help an ohm pool, and maybe we can talk about that in a second. But the kind of easier to understand shapes are, pretend this green is not Tether. It's just some arbitrary, like, new utility token that is trying to do an IDO, trying to launch OPEX. So you don't know how much it's priced yet. So one way to do price discovery is actually just put a whole bunch of that token in a pool and let the market decide how much it's worth. So swaps will happen up until the price where there's kind of equilibrium. If you did that with a uniform distribution, you would end up selling a lot of tokens at the low price, just as many at any price, basically. But you can create kind of this ramp distribution, and what that happens is now at the low price, you don't sell many tokens. At the high price, you sell a lot more tokens. So it lets you do price discovery through an IDO for a new protocol token cheaply.
That's really smart. Wow.
And then there's a couple other things you can do. So that's we call that a cell ramp. Another thing a protocol might want to do is have support. Say they're trying to hold a peg, and it's the price is above peg or below peg. They might only want liquidity on one side of the price. So maybe they only want to bring tether, and that creates the sort of buy wall for tether. So it creates a little bit of a wall that will protect the peg in this direction, but not that direction, for instance.
Right.
And then the last kind of interesting thing is, well, there's a couple more. So another one is if you want to create a buy wall at a low price. So say, you at 10% below price, you as a protocol will have some liquidity in a DEX, and you lock this LP token. You're basically signifying there's X amount of dollars to buy this token at that price, and it's locked, so it will always be there. And this provides price support for your protocol. Another thing that's really nice for is like lending markets. So we're seeing with LSTs or really any protocol token that wants to get mass adoption. A way to do that is to have yields that then can be rehypothecated in something like Aave or a lending market, where you're doing this recursive borrowing and lending loop to get leverage on your yield. As a protocol, in order to support that loop, you need a whole bunch of liquidity in a DEX, right? That's right. An Euler look at.
Sure.
And a cheap way to do that, so one way to do that is to get liquidity near price, but you can actually do it more efficiently from a protocol's perspective. If you put the liquidity, say 10%, 20% below price, and it also lets borrowers kind of manage liquidation if they set up these walls. So there's, it's early days for us. We're still kind of talking with protocols about these mechanisms, but there's new flexibility here that doesn't exist in DeFi, until Maverick came along.
That's fascinating. I'll tell you, I've interviewed multiple founders who said, kind of one of the nightmares of their lives is that rather than spending their time building, they are now spending their time managing liquidity. And the fact that, real quickly, I'm curious kind of how you got to this brilliant UI. Was this something you guys envisioned from the beginning, that you wanted people to be able to basically not draw, but form what they wanted to create? Or was this something you guys kind of came to over time? Because this is so smart. Like I can really see when someone familiar from a protocol or familiar with a particular pair or whatever understands and has an understanding of what they need or what their goals are or what something does normally, how powerful this can be for them.
Yeah. So, so where this came from, I think early on we had this part of our idea was liquidity shouldn't be uniformly shaped. And actually the first version of our AMM kind of made everything Gaussian distributed. And that was kind of fascinating with that math, but it ended up being really gassy to do. Okay. And then we realized instead of having this closed form Gaussian thing, which is Curve kind of has this really fancy sort of math behind their shape as well. But the problem with that is it's a little bit hard to intuit what's going on.
Right.
Much easier. The Uniswap framing of price versus liquidity is really nice. So then we realized, well, we don't actually need to have a closed form distribution shape. We can just let users pick bins and make whatever shape they want. And that's more flexible, more intuitive, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of how we landed on this.
That's brilliant. I'm not providing massive liquidity in the market, so I may not have encountered this if it existed elsewhere, but this is really, this is elegant. I love this.
Thanks.
Really. Yeah. It's brilliant.
So, let me
keep going. I'm sorry. I'm just fascinated by that.
Yeah, there's a little more that you might like here then. So we got this, we got that feedback actually from a few protocols that, so there's millions of dollars every month, maybe tens of millions of dollars, probably more than that, that's incentivizing LPs. So this is outside incentives from a protocol. So like Lido is an example. They add incentives to the Curve pool to the tune of $2-3 million a month.
Wow.
And the challenge with that is the Curve pool, they have to incentivize all the liquidity kind of equally. So when you incentivize that pool, the pool is in whatever balance it's in. It's got half this token, half that token. And you as an incentivizer have to be agnostic to which of those tokens you get. You're getting it in that proportion whether you like it or not.
Right.
And so what we heard from protocols is actually they don't want to incentivize in the proportion that's already there. Like oftentimes they want to rearrange the proportion. That's the whole point of the incentives, to hold a peg or to get quote asset in a pool 2 or whatever it may be. They actually want to do something a little different. And this is where we came up with this idea of boosted pools. So this LUSD example is really neat. So the LUSD folks, they actually, LUSD is a stable coin.
Yep, one of my favorite projects.
It's got this interesting minting mechanism where LUSD is a little above peg always based on how it's minted. So it's never below 1. It's never above 1.1.
Right.
It drifts in between there. And so something like a stable swap pool, like you have on Curve or any of the stable swap clones these days, is tricky because the peg is not really 1. It's this soft peg in this range. And what happens in a stable swap pool for LUSD is you end up not having much LUSD. When price is above peg, LUSD leaves the pool and you just have the other asset.
Makes sense.
And that's a problem for LUSD because it means it's not very liquid, right?
Right.
And so in Maverick, they created this distribution which is overweight LUSD. It's asymmetric. So for people who aren't seeing the screen, it's purple is LUSD and blue is Circle or USDC. And it's overweight and asymmetric in the LUSD side. And this is the distribution that they were always hoping they could.
That's brilliant.
And what's super cool is they can also incentivize this. So this just got turned on, and I think there'll be incentives here at some point. So now instead of doing LP farming for an entire pool, a protocol can incentivize a given distribution inside of a pool. And maybe one day they want to incentivize this distribution, the next day they want to incentivize that distribution. So it gives it we call it the surgical flexibility to do liquidity shaping on their like aggregate liquidity across all of DeFi, all of crypto. So yeah, it's
that's very exciting. Yeah, and good you to point out. Those of you just listening, the interface elements we're talking about are bars that Bob is dragging up and down, or able to drag up and down, to actually form an image of the way they want the liquidity shaped based on and the distribution of it. And so in this case, there's a larger side up for what Liquidy's doing versus the smaller side down on the opposing token, USDC in this case. That's fantastic. I got to believe that this capability, as well as the kind of that idea that you were just talking about of being 10% or whatever below for kind of maintaining peg or maintaining price range, is for the protocols you've spoken to, I have to believe that's a pretty exciting proposition.
Yeah, no, I think it is. I think we're so I think we're going to see more and more incentives. So we just released this last week. We call it Phase 2, and I think we're starting to see more and more protocols incentivizing targeted liquidity like this. So one of the other use cases that we kind of just fell into. Let me go back to the pools page. So if you think about what's a challenging pair to LP in DeFi right now, well, let me walk through some history. So, Curve had this genius insight, Michael over there, that there's too much slippage for stablecoin pairs in an XYK kind of UniV2 pool. So he said, let's do some new math to have concentration at price equals 1. That'll reduce the slippage, it increases efficiency, and it's great. And then he had this genius tokenomics model too. And so what ended up coming out of all of that is the Curve Wars, which is really the stablecoin wars, right?
Right.
So every stablecoin, there was the AMM to be at because it was effective, and then it had tokenomics and incentivizing mechanisms to let the tokens compete. So you see Frax or DAI or Circle or Tether, they're all trying to become the stable kind of quote pair in DeFi, and they competed that out in Curve, and that's still ongoing. But that was a big narrative a year or two ago. Where we see kind of a neat spot for Maverick to operate is in these LST pairs. So liquid staking tokens. We use tokens instead of derivatives, but LST, LSD. Where you've got a yielding ETH token like WST ETH, RETH, CB ETH, Swell ETH, unsheath. There's dozens of them now, right?
Right.
The challenge with LPing this pair is it's going to move 4% in price a year.
Right.
But the range is so narrow that you'd love to be really concentrated. So if you go look at these pairs on Uniswap, people are inching along their distribution, right? Which is gassy and it requires a lot of infrastructure and sophistication. And this is where Maverick, we kind of lucked into this sweet spot. But the movement modes, whether it's mode right or left, lets you follow that price without having to do that rebalancing. It all happens natively. So we see kind of an LST war playing out already, where all of these LSTs want to be the replacement for ETH. They want to see a pair like, so here we get GAL WST ETH.
Right.
Typically, GAL token would be paired with ETH, right?
Right.
But as an LP, why pair it with ETH if you could have yielding ETH sitting in the pool?
Of course.
And so we'll see more, but the other LSTs would love this to be their LST, right? So it's exactly what happened in the curve wars. And we think that we're kind of well positioned to let these LSTs try to gain market share and volume across DeFi.
Oh, that makes complete sense. And I definitely can see that coming. And it wasn't something I thought about. Like, every day there's another LST or LSD hitting the market. And I just had an interview with the project that's doing a stable based on lending on staked ETH coming off Lido. And anyway, so yeah, I think you guys are in a really good spot, especially right now. It'll attract more attention. ETH, just saw a piece that said ETH has averaged last week 8.6% because of Pepe. So
wow. Yeah. I didn't see that. That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. That's crazy. That's fantastic. I love that. I always love these stories of teams that build a protocol and then realize functionality they hadn't seen prior, or strategies or market segments that could make use of it that they hadn't seen prior. And again, it kind of goes back to what you were talking about earlier is because all of this is so flexible and there's so many opportunities to kind of customize how you interact with it that it lends itself to be able to create even more and more opportunities. That's fantastic, man. Thanks. This is really cool.
Thanks. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Thanks.
So, in terms of strategically recruiting LPs, how is that process going for you? Do you feel like you're getting the kind of traction you want? Is it something you've been aggressively doing, or was it you kind of wanted to get to this point with your releases to really go to market hardcore for it?
Well, I think there's no one way protocols attract LPs is by giving out protocol tokens. So there's no NAV doesn't have a protocol token, so there's no real incentive that we can give other than better performance, better capital efficiency through the just math mechanics. So I think that's really the plan for the near term here is just letting LPs find it organically, having talks like this, and then partnering with these protocols that start incentivizing these boosted positions because the protocol has their own objectives where they're trying to put it into the pool. So it's really trying to have a symbiotic relationship with the protocols to get liquidity in there.
Well, look, I definitely agree with you. Obviously, I think the real value is in the functionality and the better performance that they can get out of this, right? So that alone, getting exposure and that alone for the tools that you guys offer should be enough, right? Compared to what's in the market, I would say that you've got a superior experience and superior ability to perform with earning money as an LP. So I think that part of it's not difficult. And certainly, a PR campaign is a great way to get there. So and get attention for it. But what the nice thing is this world is small, right? And so once you have a few satisfied folks, if they don't feel like they're directly competing against each other, then the word will spread too. So it's part of the process. So do you do you think kind of the strategy of leveraging the aggregators is kind of your longer term strategy, or do you really have a goal of kind of building Maverick into a brand where people are coming directly into the protocol and interacting with it?
No, I think it's the latter. So, we're standing on the shoulders of giants here. Like Uniswap has really blazed the trail. I think they've done a great job. They've even got a mobile app and essentially a wallet and whatnot. So I think as we get more brand recognition, it makes sense to swap through our app. The gas is slightly less because the router can be a little more efficient without going through an aggregator.
Nice.
So I think we'll start seeing more of that. And then, so we'll see. Actually, and I didn't mention we did also launch on ZK Sync. So we're one of the few dexes there.
Oh, nice.
We're the top dex on ZK Sync. We're on mainnet and ZK Sync. So if you're looking for a place to LP or trade on ZK Sync, check that out.
That's awesome. That's a good strategy. I love that. I think it almost seems like, I just was looking at a protocol yesterday called Native, and I haven't taken a deep dive into it. I just briefly was kind of glancing at what they do, but it's actually this model of embedding the DEX functionality into protocols. So rather than you having to leave to go back and swap something and come back to the protocol to deposit or do whatever you're going to do on that protocol, borrow, whatever it is, they integrate directly with the protocol, right? And so the swap can happen within the interface to the protocol. But what was interesting about theirs was they were trying to do this, some kind of aggregated liquidity amongst all the protocols that are using the platform. But what I thought strategically was really interesting was this idea of embedding the DEX functionality. And from my perspective, and I'm not telling you how to run your business, but from my perspective, with the advantages that you give to the protocols, it would seem to be even more so in their best interest to be driving people to Maverick, right? Because they're strategically trying to make sure that they maintain what they're maintaining through your interface.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, there's what are essentially wallets now trying to do this too. So Socket's an example. And that's sort of their pitch too, is they can embed, and they're really just calling APIs from the aggregators, as I understand it.
They are,
which is fine. Simple's better. But I think it's the same sort of thing where, wherever you need liquidity, different chain, or to do LPing in a certain ratio, you can use that widget to do it. So it's interesting, kind of building protocols. Where do you want to live in the stack? How vertically integrated do you want to be? What else do you want to do? I think I'm personally more fascinated with going and doing more smart contract things. So,
So you're expecting to build more on this or around this?
Yeah. I think we'll eventually get back to other types of trading. So GMX has been super successful, but I think there's lots of room to do new things there. I think lending even is still in the early stages. Oracle-based lending and whatnot there may be other options there. So, and
awesome.
Yeah,
that's great, man. Okay, I have two final questions I ask everybody, but before I do that, is there anything else we need to talk about Maverick that we missed out on or that we didn't cover?
No.
Are you guys hiring? Are you
Sure. Yeah, we're always looking for qualified people or exceptional people. So cool. Hit me on. I'm on Twitter. I'm pretty active on Twitter, so I'll answer your DMs.
Great. And I'll put your Twitter handle in the show notes, so if people want to reach out, they can.
Great.
Excellent. All right. So last two questions. First question is, I always ask everybody, who's someone in DeFi and crypto that you either have a lot of respect for or that you just think is incredibly critical to where we've gotten to today or to the future of where we're going?
Well, I think Vitalik's an obvious one, right?
Sure.
And then I think Curve and Uniswap are super impressive protocols. So Mike and Hayden have done a great job. I don't know either of those guys personally, but I think they've done a fantastic job. So yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. So founders, if you had any lessons over the last 2 years that you could pass on to other founders trying to build in this space, what would you pass along?
Well, it's maybe a cliche, and so this is not my first startup. I did big big venture-backed Web2 security startup before this. But it's interesting doing B2C. That was B2B, where you've got consumers and whatnot. Anyways, I think the big thing is like there are definitely dark days. And you're like, oh man, this math is not working out.
That's brutal. What
are we gonna do? And it all seemed to resolve. You just keep grinding and grinding and grinding, and it's worked out so far. So I think that's a message that I take away from the experience for sure.
Keep grinding.
Yeah.
Keep pushing through.
Yeah. And again, it's kind of cliched, don't suffer the setbacks, keep grinding, but it definitely applied in the building of Maverick.
That's great. That's really good. That's fantastic. Well, I really appreciate you coming on, Bob. I'm actually, I'm really intrigued with what you guys have got going here. And I will definitely take a deeper dive. So thanks for your time.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Brad. Thanks for having me. Great
cool.
From the experience for sure.
Keep grinding.
Yeah.
Keep pushing through.
Yeah. And again, it's kind of cliched, don't suffer the setbacks, keep grinding, but it definitely applied in the building of Maverick. That's
great. That's really good. That's fantastic. Well, I really appreciate you coming on, Bob. I'm actually, I'm really intrigued with what you guys have got going here. And I will definitely take a deeper dive. So thanks for your time.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Brad. Thanks for having me.
Cool.